A listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, world condemnation of Israel's latest missile attack. This time, Benjamin Netanyahu has launched missiles on Qatar. The Israeli leader claiming he was targeting key Hamas terrorists, but the attack was on an important US ally that is currently hosting peace talks. We unpack exactly what this latest attack means for the fragile peace process and what the US will do next. But first, let's check the afternoon headlines this Wednesday, the 10th of September. The Polish military has called a Russian drone attack on its country as an act of aggression that posed, quote, a real threat to the safety of its citizens. Polish armed forces shot down a number of Russian drones during repeated violations of its airspace. It marks the first direct engagement by the NATO country since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Australian defence and security expert Dr Matthew Sussex has told the ABC it is an alarming development.
But nonetheless, even if it is a mistake, it's certainly an act of aggression when you have armed drones with heavy explosives overflying your territory. So not only, I think, are the Poles entirely justified in shooting them down, but this probably should spark a wider discussion within the NATO members about whether or not they're going to tolerate this type of behaviour by Russia in the future.
4 airports in Poland were temporarily closed because of what officials described as unplanned military activity relating to ensuring state security. Officials warning a military operation remains underway, urging residents to stay indoors. The federal government has announced it will spend nearly $2 billion arming Australia with dozens of autonomous Ghost Shark submarines, with the first to enter service in January. The crewless stealth drones developed over the past 3 years are reportedly capable of long-range surveillance, intelligence gathering and strike missions, and can be piloted from both land and sea. The Federal Defence Minister Richard Marles describing the technology as world-leading, saying it would expand Australia's ability to operate far from our shores.
This is the highest tech capability in the world. It exemplifies the fact that Australia is leading the world in terms of autonomous underwater military capabilities.
The announcement comes just a week after the Chinese president showcased Beijing's military power with a massive parade in Tiananmen Square featuring tanks, warplanes and nuclear missiles. And Apple has announced its slimmest ever smartphone, the iPhone Air, at its annual product launch event in California. Measuring just 5.6 millimetres thick and weighing around 165 grams, the iPhone Air sacrifices some features for its ultra-thin design, including a single rear camera and no physical SIM support. But Apple says it's more durable and power efficient than previous models. In Australia, it will start at around $1,800. Now it's time to get into our deep dive on Israel's attack on Qatar. The UN, US and Australian governments have all condemned the missile strikes, with Qatar's Prime Minister saying his country, quote, reserves the right to respond to Israel's blatant attack. Donald Trump says he's not thrilled about the situation, with the world closely watching on to see what happens next. Defence expert Dr Jennifer Parker joins us for her analysis on exactly what this means for the US-Israeli relationship and the ever-fragile Middle East peace talks. Jennifer, thanks so much for joining us. First question many are asking, of course, of these latest developments is why would Benjamin Netanyahu launch these missile attacks?
Yeah, look, that is the big question. And to be honest, it really does seem counterproductive. We've seen a lot of criticism, international criticism of Israel in light of these attacks, and that's been growing in the lead up to the UN General Assembly at the end of September. I guess what Israel is trying to do is put pressure on the Hamas leadership, saying you're not safe anywhere. And actually, we did see a similar thing happen in July last year, where Israel took out the political leader of Hamas whilst he was in Iran. So it's part of that campaign of telling Hamas they're not safe anywhere. Why now? Clearly in response to two attacks that have occurred on Israeli civilians in Jerusalem yesterday and on Israeli soldiers in Gaza yesterday. But it does seem counterproductive for Israel.
We know that the US government has come out pretty firmly, like many other countries right across the world, and condemned this attack. What does this mean in regards to the Israel-US alliance? Clearly, Donald Trump is furious by this.
So clearly he is, and him and Benjamin Netanyahu actually have a decades-long relationship, but it hasn't always been a positive relationship. But we haven't seen anything from Trump in terms of restricting weapons flows to Israel or being more critical in a way that impacts their operations. He's just said he's not thrilled. And of course he's not thrilled. I mean, Qatar is an ally of the US. There are about 10,000 US troops stationed in Qatar. And so really it puts the US in a bad position. But does this really fundamentally change the US-Israeli relationship? We're not seeing any signs of that right now. I think we need to probably watch the next couple of days to see if Trump says anything more serious or takes any action. My gut feel is he's probably not going to, though.
We've even seen the families, Jennifer, come out of the Israeli hostages absolutely fearful that this latest strike will actually jeopardise their safety or could end up in these hostages being killed. It seems that he is increasingly, and I'm talking about Benjamin Netanyahu here, is increasingly isolating himself from the few supporters he has left.
Yeah, look, he very much is. But you've got to remember too that Netanyahu is actually balancing a lot of domestic pressure from both sides. So absolutely the families have not been supportive of his actions, to be honest, for a long time. And there is a view within Israel that Netanyahu's actions have consistently undermined ceasefires since the last ceasefire finished in March this year. But he's also balancing the fact that his government is only able to function because of his support from the right, which is pushing him to go further. And we've got to remember too that in the midst of this, there is reporting that actually the US had put a proposal to Hamas that Hamas were considering right now that may have been 48 hostages, the remaining hostages, about 20 of which are thought to be alive, released in 48 hours, with Israel releasing Palestinian prisoners in response as part of a 60-day ceasefire. Now, Hamas were meant to be considering that. How seriously? We're not sure, but Israeli citizens whose families are in Gaza are right to be concerned about this because, it looks like Israel has tried to target the negotiating team. Now, Israel have said they've targeted Hamas leaders who are responsible for the 7th of October attacks. Hamas says that they have targeted the negotiations team. It certainly wasn't a diplomatic quarter of Qatar where they have been based. And the son of the chief negotiator is reportedly to have been killed. So it's put back these negotiations a long way.
In regards to that, Jennifer, everyone is now questioning whether this has literally blown up any chance of any type of negotiation or peace deal that we already know is incredibly fragile. Do you think it has had irreversible damage to that peace process?
Look, I'm not sure if it's irreversible damage. I mean, certainly there's going to be a lack of trust in Israel's ability to negotiate in good faith. Having reportedly tried to target the lead negotiators, there's probably going to be a lack of trust in the US putting forward plans as well, because certainly the US is saying they had nothing to do with this attack, so is Israel, but there is a wider view that they are linked together. So it's going to impact that trust in the negotiations. It certainly set them back. Is it irreversible? Look, eventually Israel can't continue this. Eventually they're going to have to come to the table. Hamas certainly can't continue this. So is there going to be talks again? Look, I would suspect so, but not in the near term.
Jennifer, let's talk about this developing news now coming from Poland. The Polish Prime Minister says its nation's military has shot down objects after repeated violations of its airspace during a Russian attack on Ukraine. As I mentioned, this is developing as we record this podcast. The Polish Defence Minister saying the country was in constant contact with NATO and that the military was searching for debris from downed drones. Now, we know that Russia has continued to really push the boundary with Poland. How concerning is this new escalation?
Look, I think we need to see a little bit more of the details. It is concerning. It's the first NATO country to shoot down Russian drones. There have been some violations of Polish airspace previously during this conflict, certainly a Russian missile that seems to have gone astray and landed in Poland. So it is part of a broader Russian strategy of not just prosecuting their illegal war in Ukraine, but trying to provoke the NATO countries on the borders. Poland has clearly gotten fed up with this and now aim to take decisive action. What comes from this next? I think we'll need to understand what the nature of these incursions into Polish airspace were, how often it was happening, and how much. But it is significant. And really, when we think about this and linking it to our discussion of Israel, what we are seeing across the world right now is states resorting to the use of force to solve their differences. And this certainly isn't good for the globe, and it's not good for Australia's security, because the message all of this is sending towards countries such as China, for example, who may wish to use force to settle their differences in the South China Sea or in Taiwan, is that the world order is fundamentally changing.
And just on that point, Jennifer, I'm glad you've raised it, because it does seem to almost point to the fact that all of these developments over the last couple of days and weeks, there are no rules, there is no world order. How does this play out, even if you would say that Benjamin Netanyahu with these latest strikes may not actually care what the US thinks?
Well, look, I think he's certainly made the assessment that he has some leverage over Trump, or that Trump's not going to react. Now, whether that turns out to be the case, it's not clear. Israel is still very much dependent on the US to keep their supply of weapons going and keep them in this fight. So he certainly probably does care what the US thinks. I just think he's probably assumed that the US are not going to care too much about this, and he may have got that calculation wrong. But I guess in terms of the international world order, look, this has been something that Australian leadership has been talking about, certainly for the last 5 years since our Defence Strategic Update in 2020. But we are now seeing the last 12 months, not only this ongoing conflict in Europe, this conflict in the Middle East, we've now seen conflict between India and Pakistan, between Thailand and Cambodia. There is this trend now where states do not feel restrained, or as restrained as they had been, in terms of resorting to the use of force. And this really does say that the international rules-based order, if it ever existed, has fundamentally broken down in the last 12 months.
For everyone is watching with great interest, and very concerningly so, about how Donald Trump reacts to these latest developments with Israel and these missile attacks on Qatar. How do you think he plays this? Because some may argue there's two different schools of thought. He's incredibly unpredictable. Then others say, well, that's what makes him a great negotiator, because you never know what he's going to do. And I ask you that question, what do you think Donald Trump will do? What will his next play be?
Look, it is hard to say. I would say that he would need to take some degree of action against Israel beyond saying he's not thrilled. I mean, the US values its relationships with the Gulf states. As I mentioned before, they are an ally of Qatar. They rely on Qatar to have US forces hosted there. It is the biggest US base in the Middle East. We also know from the earlier strikes that the US undertook on Iran a couple of months back that when pushed, Trump actually does take some degree of action. If he doesn't take any further action against Israel, there will be real questions about his strength. There will be real questions about the US's strength in the world and globally, and their ability to deter states from doing things against the US interests. So I do think he's going to have to go much further than saying, I'm not thrilled, but he also needs to play to his political base, where there is a lot of support for Israel. So, look, interesting to see what happens next. Potentially some sort of restriction in weapons flows, some stronger condemnation. And we've got to remember too, Qatar has still maintained the right to respond to Israel as well, and they'll be expecting some sort of US support in that. Now, what the nature of that response is, it's not clear. It's unlikely to be a military or a kinetic response, but I think they will have to respond in some way, and they'll be looking to the US to support that response.
We really appreciate your analysis on this developing situation, Jennifer. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much.
That was defence expert Dr. Jennifer Parker from the University of New South Wales. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'd love you to subscribe or follow us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast, and we'll be back in your feed tomorrow morning. I'm Natarsha Belling. Thanks for your company.